In this video on Mediterranean knotted lace, I am going to show you how to make closed loops, which leads into how to make bows. So I've started by just putting 8 loops on a piece of fabric. This is just 8 basic loops that are here on my fabric. And now to get started, I need to turn my work and use a carry up loop to get into the top of my very first basic loop. And a carry up loop is like a basic loop, except that you are moving up one row and you make it sort of small so that it snugs against the side of your loop. And now that I have done this, I have to make what is called a long picot or a long loop picot. So I'm going to go into the same loop that I've just worked in. I'm going to put my thread in just like I usually would. There we go. I'm going to pull my knot out. So there's my single knot, my single figure 8 knot. And then I have to decide how tall I want my closed loops to be. So at this point, you have to decide how long that very first long loop picot will be, because the size of this picot is going to determine the size of all of your closed loops from here on out. So if you think it should be taller, you can use the tip of your needle to pull on the loop here, and you can adjust the size of your long loop picot by pulling out the knot and then adjusting it. And once you have it as long as you want it, then you'll set your work and pull that knot nice and tight. You need very tight knots when you are making Mediterranean knotted lace. So this is going to be my long loop picot. And now I have to make a closed loop into the top of my long loop picot. So I'm going to come back over here and insert my needle into the top of that long loop, pass my working thread from right to left over the top, and then go ahead and make my single knot. And now when I do this, I want to make sure that my closed loop isn't huge. I don't want it to be a great big loop like this, because that's not the look we're going for. So I'm going to pull this inside edge and snug it down a little bit, but it doesn't have to be super tight. It just has to be sort of in line, and it's okay if it bows out a little bit, because we don't want it super tight. If it's too tight, this closed loop will start to bend your picot over, and we don't want that to happen. So you do have to give it just a little bit of an angle right here on this closed loop. So we made the carry up loop into our first basic loop of our turned row. We made our long loop picot so that we had the height that we needed to make our closed loops from here on out. And then in order to get to where we needed to be to make our closed loops, we had to close to the top of our long picot. You only do this once to start a row. You don't make this long picot again. So now what you're going to do is we are going to drop a large picot down into the next loop. So we're going to bring this down to the next loop here. We're going to make sure that our working thread is over the top of our needle. Then we'll grab our eye threads and swing them up and around in a single knot, because remember, we are making lace, so we're using single knots. And the key to this is that when you make these closed loops, you have to leave enough space for both the closed loop and the intermediate or the basic loop that will appear between them. So you need a little more thread than you think you need, and it almost has to make a bit of a reverse S shape. This one could probably have just a little bit more thread. So like this, and then I'm going to set my knot nice and tight. And it is difficult to gauge the size that you need, so it does take practice, because what you need to do now that we've dropped this long loop, or this large loop down, is we need to go in and close a loop to this. So you're going to use the loop that you have just made, so this loop that you've just made, and put your needle in, pass your working thread, because we're doing a closed loop, over the top from right to left, wrap that needle with your single knot, and this then is also a difficult part, because what you have to do is try to gauge how tall to make your loop based on the previous loop that you've made, and how much thread to leave between the two knots to form the basic loop at the top. So just do the best you can, and then again, very tight knots. You need tight knots, because if you don't have tight knots, this will all come apart. So now we have our first long loop. We closed to that long loop. We dropped a large loop down and closed back to this loop again. And that's what makes these closed loops in a series. So we're going to do that again. We'll go into the next basic loop at the bottom of our series. So all the way down at the bottom of the series. Make sure your working thread is in place. Wrap your single knot around. And again, as you start to pull this down into place, you have to gauge how much, and this is the loop that we're going to catch right here. See how this piece is inside the figure eight? This is the piece that will be caught. And you have to sort of eyeball the size, because you don't want it too large and you don't want it too small, because it has to make our closed loop and the basic loop that it fakes above it. And then you'll pull your knot nice and tight. And again, it makes almost a bit of a reverse S shape. So now we have to close to this again. So to do that, we're going to take that needle once again to the inside, back through this loop that we've just created, move our working thread from right to left over the top and into position, wrap the tail threads around in order to make our single knot. And again, we have to pay attention to our height and the placement of our knot to try to get them as equal as possible. And then again, pull that knot nice and tight. You have to have tight knots. So now we have two closed loops after our long loop with a closed loop into the top of it. So again, you only do this once. For the rest of your row or round, you would drop these long loops down. So drop a nice long loop down. Again, paying attention to the size and shape of that loop, and then closing back to the loop that you have just made. And paying attention to the size of your previous loops and the placement of those knots, so that you can try to get as equal and even loops as possible. And that is how you make a closed loop for Mediterranean knotted lace.